For this video, what I want to do is talk to you about the types of errors that can be made in a hypothesis test. So in statistics, when you get to the end of a hypothesis test, you're going to come to one of two conclusions. You are either going to reject the null hypothesis, or you are going to fail to reject the null hypothesis. So this video isn't about how to make those decisions. It's about being aware of the fact that sometimes when you make those decisions, you make an error in your decision-making process. It has nothing to do with the mechanics of your test. It's just that you ended up with what is known statistically speaking as a bad sample. So the two types of errors that we have in a hypothesis test are called type 1 and type 2 errors. So a type 1 error occurs if the null hypothesis is rejected when it is actually true. A type 2 error occurs when we fail to reject the null hypothesis when it is actually false. So basically what we have here is our two decisions. We have the decision to fail to reject or reject. Okay. If the null hypothesis is actually true and you fail to reject the null hypothesis, then you made the correct decision. If the null hypothesis is really true and you rejected it, that's when you committed a type 1 error. If the null hypothesis is false and you fail to reject it, that's when you create a type 2 error. And if the null hypothesis is false and you end up rejecting it, then you end up with the correct decision. Okay, as far as these two errors go, almost always the type 2 error is more severe. A lot of times with a type 1 error, but when we get to the end and we reject the null hypothesis, a lot of times we do further testing with it. And so the further testing will end up coming up with the fact that really the null hypothesis is true and we just ended up with a faulty answer. With type 2, we almost always don't retest. So what I want to do is give you a couple of examples in the real world of where you would see a type 1 or type 2 situation. So the first one that I have is the court of law. You can think about this kind of as like the court of law. When you go into the court, you are supposed to be innocent until proven guilty. It is not the other way around. So at the end of the court trial, you end up making a decision. And so a type 1 error would be reaching a guilty verdict when the defendant is not guilty. So this would be really bad for the person who gets sent to jail. They didn't commit the crime, but the jury found them to be guilty when they weren't. A type 2 error is reaching a not guilty verdict when the defendant is guilty. So the defendant actually committed the crime. Maybe the crime was for murder and now you just release somebody that actually committed the murder back into the public. And so now they feel like they can get away with things. Neither one of them are good situations. In a type 1 error, you are sending somebody to jail that didn't do the crime. And in a type 2, you are sending somebody back out into the public that really did commit the crime. Okay. So another example that I often give my students in class is like a medical test. So a medical test, it could be something like testing for cancer. Or if you are pregnant during the 3rd trimester, you do a test for gestational diabetes. So a type 1 error in a medical test would be that you tested positive for cancer when you don't have it, or you tested positive for type 2 diabetes when you don't have it. Most of the time with testing, the first time around, they do a test that's not very, it's not very hard to do. It's easy to go through. And a lot of times they'll send you for further testing if you test positive on the first one. Okay. Where with a type 2 test, the testing would come up negative for cancer when you do actually have cancer. And now you're not getting the treatment that you need. And so you could potentially die or have some really bad things happen. And most of the time that if you test negative for it, they're not going to continue for testing. Okay, the last scenario that I usually go over with my students to try to get them to understand the difference between type 1 and type 2 testing would be like in engineering. In engineering, they do stress testing on bridges to make sure that they are safe. And so a type 1 error would be doing a stress test on a bridge. And after you did the stress test, you found that the bridge wasn't safe. And you went through and you did repairs on a bridge that was actually safe. So the bridge was actually safe. You found based on the stress test that it was unsafe and that it needed repaired. So you went ahead and did repairs on a bridge that really didn't need it. So it cost some money, but nobody was harmed in doing this. A type 2 error is you're doing a stress test on the bridge and you found that the bridge is safe. There's nothing wrong with it. Everything looks good. When in actuality, it's unsafe. And so now you could have catastrophic failure. People could be driving home during rush hour, the bridge collapses, and you didn't repair a bridge that was unsafe based on the stress test. Okay, so just to recap, remember that a type 1 error occurs if you reject the null hypothesis. So you came up with the conclusion that I'm going to reject the null hypothesis, but the null hypothesis was actually true and you really shouldn't have made that decision. A type 2 error occurs when we fail to reject the null hypothesis when it is actually false. So we said, oh, the null hypothesis appears to be true, and we failed to reject it. So like I said, most of the time type 2 is going to be worse because we don't usually continue to retest if we end up failing to reject. When we reject, a lot of times we continue with further testing and we catch the type 1 errors. As always, thanks for watching. If you have any questions, please let me know. If there are additional topics you need me to cover, please let me know that as well.